Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher and this is Presidential Chronicles, a series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Andrew Johnson, and the focus is high crimes and misdemeanors. The year is 1867, and the conflict between President Johnson and the radical Republican-led legislature in Congress, well, that was reaching an apex, kind of uncharted territory, as Congress had continued to kind of expand its usurpation of the other branches of government in what Johnson was convinced was unconstitutional ways. And now the question is, what was going to happen next? But let's recap what they've done. They passed the military Reconstruction bill. What did that do? It effectively cut the president, the commander-in-chief, out of the chain of command of the military. They passed the Tenure of Office Act, which was a direct assault on the prerogative of every president since Washington to dismiss any members of the executive branch at his own will, and he saw nothing in the Constitution that allowed Congress to do this, but they could override his veto. Why? Because they refused to seat the elected members of the House and Senate coming from 10 of the 11 seceded states. One, Tennessee, they had been readmitted, but the other 10 states, their members of Congress, the House and Senate, were not seated, and so there was no counter to the radical Republicans who now had veto-proof majorities in both houses, passing laws over Johnson's vetoes on a regular basis. Why did they do this? Well, they saw it as their right. They saw it as a political right and a moral right. The Republicans in the House and the Senate believed this is what was demanded of them by the victory on the battlefield in the Civil War, to actually make the South pay and really uplift the rights of the freedmen, and to do it by imposing federal will. Andrew Johnson thought that was not the case. He didn't think it was going to be his policy. It was not Abraham Lincoln's policy. These were unconstitutional power grabs, and it was hurting the nation. Johnson was typically not one to just take things lying down. Even though he couldn't give orders by law to those military commanders overseeing those districts in the South, he could fire them. And that's what he intended to do. And he set his sights on General Phil Sheridan, who happened to be a favorite of General Ulysses Grant, the commanding general at the time. But Sheridan had been outspoken against the president and his authority, his policies, and Johnson wanted him gone. Well, this was tense, a perilous situation. Adam Badeau was a close confidant of Grant, and he said at the time the president disregarded the will of Congress, the officers of the Army disregarded his. The situation was approaching mutiny on one side, or else treason on the other. Johnson also wanted to get rid of his Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton. Stanton was working behind the scenes, frankly, supporting the radical Republicans in Congress, and Johnson was tired of it. He decided he had to go. So August 5th, 1867, he sent over a letter to Stanton firing him. Stanton refused. He refused to go. So what could Johnson do? Tenure of Office Act said he couldn't fire him. But since Congress was not in session at the time, that act gave him permission to suspend Stanton, which would then be addressed by the Senate when it came back into session. So that's what he did less than a week later. And he told his aide, Colonel William Moore at the time, "The turning point at last has come. The Rubicon is crossed." Johnson was getting serious. Well, General Grant was now both the acting Secretary of War as well as the commanding general. Hardly an ally, though, of the president. They had really started to go their separate ways over the course of the last year, and now Grant was really quite upset at his president over what he was trying to do to fire those military commanders in the South. But at this point, Johnson determined that Sheridan had to go, and he put his foot down, telling Grant that believing that a change in command is absolutely necessary for a faithful execution of the laws, I have issued the order. And in this exercising a power that adheres to the executive under the Constitution, as Commander-in-Chief of the military and naval forces, I am discharging a duty required of me by the will of the nation, as formally declared in the supreme law of the land. Any other course would lead to the destruction of the Republic. Grant reluctantly complied. Not only was Sheridan let go, but also General Daniel Sickles was out as well as one of those commanding generals in those districts in the South. Well, the implications of all of this activity with Stanton and with the generals caught the attention, of course, of members of Congress. When Congress was last in session, they were trying to impeach the president. They spent several months investigating him, but eventually that came to a vote in the Judiciary Committee. It fell a vote short, 5-4, against moving forward with impeachment, and impeachment seemed to be dead. Well, they came back to session in that December. one of those members had changed his mind based on Johnson's behavior over these last few months. They took a revote. Now it was 5-4 in favor of impeachment, sending that to the full House. Well, now at this point, the rhetoric was flying from both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue. Johnson was continuing to critique the Congress over the Tenure of Office Act, which he ripped apart in his annual message that he presented to Congress at the beginning of the session. The members of the House and Senate were in an outroar up against the president for his actions. But when it came to impeachment, there was still caution. And sure enough, when they took a vote just a couple of weeks later, impeachment went down to defeat badly. The vote was 108-57 against impeaching the president. Thaddeus Stevens, who had been leading the impeachment march, one of the radical Republican leaders in the House, made the declaration that impeachment is dead. I'll never talk impeachment again. Well, famous last words. We'll get back to that a little bit later. The following month, what about Secretary Stanton? The Senate committee had taken a look at his case. Not surprisingly, they had voted to reinstate Stanton. And now, what was Johnson to do? The full Senate still had to vote, so he had a little bit of time to figure out what to do. He believed the Tenure of Office Act was unconstitutional, but was he willing to violate it? Willing to fire Stanton outright and potentially then be an impeachable offense? Well, he decided to meet with Grant, the acting secretary and still commanding general as well, and he made two propositions to Grant. The first was to Grant and say, look, even if the Senate reinstates Stanton, I want you to keep the job, don't stand down from being the acting secretary of war, and you and I will go to court together and we'll have this fight out in the courts. The second proposition, if Grant didn't like that one, was to at least get Grant to commit to resign the position before Stanton could actually resume his office, to effectively hand the position back to Johnson so he could put somebody else in that job in an acting role, and then they would go to court and fight it out there. Well, Grant went off to think about it briefly and came back pretty quickly and said absolutely not to the first one. The Tenure of Office Act had violation penalties of a $10,000 fine, imprisonment. Grant was not going to mess around with that. But he did agree to the second one, that he would give the position back to the president in the event the Senate had voted to put Stanton back in office. At least that's what Johnson thought. Well, 2 days later, the full Senate did vote overwhelmingly to put Stanton back into his office and get rid of the suspension. The word reached Grant, who was at the War Office. So what did Grant do? Well, he packed up, locked his office, handed the key to the Adjutant General, E.D. Townsend, and he left. No coordination whatsoever with the president. A couple of hours later, Stanton shows up. He asked for the key. He got it and resumed his post just like that. And all of a sudden, Andrew Johnson was out of luck, apparently. And he and the cabinet were livid over this. They were livid with Ulysses Grant. They called Grant to a cabinet meeting the next day and forcefully were trying to get an explanation out of him. The president said to Grant, "Was it not our understanding? Did you not assure me some time ago and again on Saturday that if you did not hold on to the office yourself, you would place it in my hands that I might select another?" Grant began to respond with, "That was my intention." But then he moved off into sort of a convoluted description and explanation about why that just didn't take place. But frankly, at this point, Grant was really annoyed. He was disgusted about the entire affair, and he said his piece and left abruptly. Well, that didn't end things because there was a pretty accusatory back and forth of letters between Johnson and Grant over the next several days. And after several of these, Grant decided to put his foot down and put an end to it. Grant wrote to the President of the United States, "And now, Mr. President, where my honor as a soldier and integrity as a man have been so violently assailed, pardon me for saying that I can but regard the whole matter from the beginning to the end as an attempt to involve me in the resistance of law, for which you hesitated to assume the responsibility and orders, and thus to destroy my character before the country." He had had enough. He went on to tell the president that per the law, he would only take orders from the Secretary of War, who happened to be Edwin Stanton. What's Johnson going to do? Well, Johnson was a fighter his whole life. He wasn't going to stop now. He decided to fire Stanton anyway. He needed one more thing. He needed an acting to step in. He first reached out to William Sherman, who was the second most popular general in the Army next to Grant. Sherman, who was very close to Grant, said, "No, I'm not doing that." But he did convince General Lorenzo Thomas to take the job. Now, Thomas was a 40-year veteran, but he had been on the outs with Stanton throughout much of the Civil War, so maybe not a surprise that he was willing to step in. And so, what did he do? Johnson sent Thomas over to the War Department. This was on a Friday, to tell Stanton he was out. Well, Stanton kind of stalled a little bit and said, you know what, I'd like to see this in writing. So Thomas said, okay, I'll come back tomorrow morning. Well, that bought Stanton a little bit of time, and it was a very busy night. Stanton was holed up in his office the whole night. Obviously, everyone in Congress had heard about this. Several of the radical Republicans had come by to offer their support, and Stanton decided he was going to take the next action. He was going to have Thomas, General Thomas, arrested for the plans to violate the Tenure of Office Act, and that's exactly what he did. He ordered soldiers to pick him up, and they took him to jail. He was then taken to court. He was released on bond. And General Thomas then went to the White House and asked Andrew Johnson, the president, what he was supposed to do. And Johnson said, go over to the War Department. I'm appointing you as the Secretary of War ad interim. Go take the position. So Thomas went over to the War Department. And here you have the Secretary, Edwin Stanton, and the proposed interim Secretary, Lorenzo Thomas, standing face to face, each telling each other that they're the right Secretary of War. It's a very awkward moment. They went back and forth. Neither would stand down. Stanton wouldn't leave his office. He felt as long as he stayed in that office, he'd be the secretary, and eventually Thomas left. What a mess. There was one group that was actually giddy with glee over all of this: the radical Republicans in Congress. They felt they finally had the president. In fact, the Joint Committee on Reconstruction, the powerful body that was really running Congress at the time, was meeting that day with Congressman Stevens in his house talking impeachment. By that afternoon, they were in the House actually proposing impeachment, and that went on most of the evening. It was a fairly extensive debate. They took a vote the next day. The next day, 126 to 47 to impeach the President of the United States. Now, no articles of impeachment had been written yet. No formal charges had been written up. Now, we've heard claims in more recent times about rushed impeachments. This is what happened over a weekend. Hard to compare anything to what happened to Andrew Johnson at that point. Now, there were other efforts to impeach Johnson previously. Those were dead and buried. This was a whole new effort. It started on a Friday. By the end of the weekend, he had been impeached. The whole thing happened so quickly. There were no hearings, no evidence, no public debate, no opportunity for the defense to do anything, and no articles of impeachment had been written. Yet Andrew Johnson had been impeached over a weekend. Congressman Stevens and Congressman John Bingham then went to the Senate the next day, and they actually announced the impeachment. They asked, well, where are the articles? They said, we'll come back to you in due time. They had committed to that. In the meantime, Johnson was defiant. He said, damn them, haven't I been struggling ever since I have been in this chair to uphold the Constitution they trample underfoot? Congress assumes that the president is merely an executive compelled by his oath to execute any law passed over his veto. There is a limit to such an assumption as that. Suppose Congress should pass a law abolishing the veto power. Suppose it should pass a dozen laws of this character. Would the president be constitutionally bound to execute them as laws? Would it not be his duty, as in the present instance, to seek immediate judgment in the Supreme Court? That is exactly what Johnson needed, and it was his biggest mistake in this entire affair, because he couldn't get the case to the independent judiciary to at least have a shot at this. Why? Well, he didn't have a court case. He actually thought he had one, because remember, General Thomas had been arrested. That was a case in court that he thought they could go together, move this up to the Supreme Court, fight this out there. But Stanton had those charges dropped. So that court case went away. Johnson couldn't figure out any other way to get this into the courts, to get it to the Supreme Court, and that was his biggest error overall. Well, over the next couple of weeks, House managers were named. They produced 11 articles of impeachment. They were rather confusing, overlapping, but it basically came down to two things: that Johnson had both violated and conspired to violate the Tenure of Office Act. The 11th article was kind of a catch-all. Basically said if the jurors, the senators in trial, deemed that Johnson violated any portion of any of the other 10 articles, they could convict on the catch-all on number 11. And just like that, the President of the United States was going to trial to try to save his job in the United States Senate. But that's the story for another day. That is Andrew Johnson and High Crimes and Misdemeanors from the Life of Andrew Johnson. For more Presidential Chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher and this is Presidential Chronicles.